I signed the papers at 8:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, because that's what responsible adults do. I made coffee, fed the dog, and drove to work like it was any other day. At 10:42, an email popped up with my name spelled wrong. By noon, my keycard stopped working. No one explained why the conference room door was locked, or why my chair was gone. What I didn't know then was that every rule I trusted was about to be used against me. I used to believe that doing things the right way was a kind of protection. Not luck, not charm, just rules, clear steps, sign here, submit there, follow the process, and nothing truly bad could happen to you. That Tuesday morning started like every other workday I'd had for the last 6 years. I woke up at 6:12 a.m. because my dog, Baxter, scratched once at the bedroom door and then stopped. He always did that one scratch, never two. I rolled out of bed, pulled on sweatpants, and checked my phone while the kettle heated. No missed calls, no texts, just the weather alert. Rain afternoon. I stood at the kitchen counter stirring instant oatmeal, watching the microwave clock blink from 6:19 to 6:20. The lease renewal envelope was still on the table, unopened, exactly where I'd left it the night before. I planned to sign it that weekend. 5 more years in the same townhouse, same quiet cul-de-sac outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing dramatic, just stable. By 7:03, I was in my car, Baxter secured in the back with his harness, headed toward the office. The radio was tuned to the same local station I'd listened to since college. A traffic report. An ad for a used car dealership. A short segment about rising HOA fees in Franklin County. I remember that part because I nodded to myself, thinking, people complain too much. Fees are fees. At 8:17 a.m., I signed the papers. They weren't dramatic papers, no heavy folder, no legal language I couldn't pronounce. Just 2 forms placed neatly on a polished conference table, clipped together with a black binder clip. The ink from the pen bled slightly through the thin paper. I noticed that, but I didn't stop signing. Just standard compliance acknowledgement, Mark said, smiling from the other side of the table. Mark had been with the firm longer than anyone I knew. He wore the same navy blazer every Monday. He drank his coffee black, never used the mug warmer. I trusted him in the quiet way you trust someone you've never had a reason to question. I signed where the yellow tab pointed, initialed the bottom corner, dated it, Tuesday. I even wrote the time next to my signature, out of habit, 8:17 a.m. Appreciate you being prompt, Mark said. Makes things easier for everyone. That sentence stuck with me later. At the time, it felt like a compliment. I walked back to my desk, logged into my computer, and started my usual routine. Email, calendar. A shared spreadsheet I updated every morning before anyone else arrived. I flagged 2 entries that needed follow-up and made a note to bring them up in the weekly review. At 9:06, I refilled my water bottle. At 9:22, the printer jammed on the 3rd floor. At 9:41, I noticed that my name wasn't on the agenda for the 11 a.m. meeting. That wasn't normal, but it wasn't alarming either. Agendas changed, meetings shifted. I told myself I'd ask about it later. At 10:42, an email came through. The subject line read, "Action required." It was addressed to Allison Hart. My name is Alyssa. People misspell it all the time, so I didn't think much of that either. I opened the email and scanned it once, then again more slowly. It referenced a policy update I'd never seen, a restructuring of responsibilities, a temporary reassignment, effective immediately. The language was polite, neutral, almost careful. There was no greeting, no signature, just a PDF attachment and a sentence that said, "Please direct any questions to your department head." I clicked the attachment. It took a few seconds longer than usual to load. At 10:49, my calendar updated itself. The 11 a.m. meeting disappeared. At 10:53, I stood up and walked toward the conference room anyway. The hallway lights hummed the way they always did. Someone laughed near the break room. Someone else coughed. The building felt exactly the same. The conference room door was closed. I tried the handle. Locked. That was odd. Conference rooms weren't locked. Ever. I stood there for a second, my hand still on the handle, waiting for someone to open it from the inside. No one did. I checked my phone. 10:56. I turned back toward my desk. That's when I noticed my chair was gone. Not pushed in, not turned sideways, gone. The space where it had been was empty, clean, like it had never been there at all. My desk was still there. My monitor, my keyboard. Even the small plant I kept by the window, the one I watered every Friday at 4:30. But the chair was missing. I stood there longer than I should have, holding my water bottle, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe facilities had taken it to fix a wheel. Maybe someone had borrowed it. Maybe I'd left it somewhere else without realizing it. At 11:02, I tried to log back into my computer. The screen flashed once, then went dark. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I swiped my keycard against the reader under the desk, the way IT had shown us years ago. The light stayed red. At 11:06, I walked to the front desk. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice light. "My badge isn't working." The receptionist didn't look up right away. She was typing something, nails clicking against the keyboard. When she did look up, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Can you give me a second?" she said. I nodded and waited. She typed for a few more seconds, then frowned slightly at her screen. "Huh," she said. "That's strange." "What is?" I asked. She turned the monitor just enough that I could see lines of text scrolling past. My name appeared halfway down the page, or almost my name. Allison Hart, again. "It says here you're not scheduled to be on site today," she said. "Maybe it's a system lag." I smiled. "Because that's what you do when someone suggests something that doesn't make sense but isn't openly hostile." "I've been here since 8, I said. "I had a meeting." She nodded slowly. "Right. Well, let me check with Mark." She picked up the phone. I watched the clock on the wall behind her tick from 11:08 to 11:09. She hung up without saying anything into the receiver. "Mark's in a meeting," she said. "He'll circle back." "Okay," I said. "I'll just wait at my desk." She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." I turned back down the hallway. As I walked, I noticed small things. A whiteboard erased clean where my notes had been that morning. A stack of folders shifted slightly to the left, like someone had straightened them. The smell of fresh coffee stronger than usual. At my desk, I set my water bottle down and stood there, unsure of what to do next. That was when my phone buzzed. A text from my landlord. "Just a reminder, HOA board meeting tonight at 7. Attendance required for all unit owners." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Across the room, someone laughed again. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, every rule I had trusted, the ones I followed, defended, and believed in, would turn out to be optional. Just not for me. The building didn't eject me. That was the first thing that confused me. No one asked me to leave. No one escorted me out. No security badge flashed. No voice over the intercom. If anything, the office behaved as if I were still supposed to be there, even though the systems had quietly decided otherwise. I stood at my desk for a few minutes, then sat on the edge of it when my legs started to ache. Without a chair, it felt wrong to claim the space fully. Like I was borrowing it. Like I'd already been reassigned to the margins and just hadn't been told where those margins were. At 11:24, Mark walked past. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't look at my desk. Mark had always made eye contact. Always. Even on days when he was rushing, he'd lift his coffee cup in acknowledgement or give a quick nod. That day, his gaze stayed fixed on the glass wall at the end of the hallway, as if my entire workstation had been erased. I said his name once, not loudly, not accusatory. "Mark." He paused, just long enough for me to think he might turn around. Then he said, "I'll follow up with you this afternoon," without looking at me, and kept walking. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it worse. It was procedural. By noon, my stomach had started to knot. Not from hunger, but from the effort of staying still. I didn't want to draw attention to myself by wandering. I didn't want to leave and look guilty. I didn't want to sit on the floor and look desperate. So I stayed where I was, pretending to review notes on my phone, pretending this was a normal interruption. At 12:07, my access to the internal messaging system disappeared. At 12:19, a calendar reminder popped up on my phone for the HOA meeting that evening. I dismissed it and immediately regretted it, like I'd ignored something important without knowing why. By 12:30, the office started to empty out for lunch. People passed my desk in pairs and small groups. Some nodded politely. Some avoided looking at me. One woman I'd worked beside for 3 years gave me a tight smile and said, "Hey, the way you say it to someone you're not sure you're allowed to talk to anymore." I realized then that something had already been said, maybe not officially, maybe not in writing, but enough people knew that they were adjusting their behavior in real time. At 12:46, I packed up my bag. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask permission. I just slid my notebook inside, zipped it closed, and walked toward the exit like I did every other day. The badge reader at the front door still worked, which felt like a small mercy I hadn't earned. Outside, the air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of Ohio afternoon that feels heavier than it looks. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes before turning the key. At home, Baxter greeted me like nothing was wrong. He wagged his tail, circled my legs, dropped his leash at my feet. Dogs don't care about organizational restructuring. They care about routine. I fed him early, then sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, refreshing my email over and over like I might have missed something obvious. Nothing came. At 2:14, I received a single-line email from HR. "Please confirm receipt of earlier correspondence." No greeting, no explanation, no signature. I replied, "Confirmed." That was it. At 3:02, Mark finally called. "Hey," he said, voice neutral, almost tired. "Sorry for the confusion earlier." "I'm confused now," I said. "So yes." He exhaled. This is one of those situations where things move faster than communication. "What situation?" I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to register as deliberate. "The firm is realigning certain roles," he said. "Your position intersects with some compliance exposure we're addressing." "I work in compliance," I said. "That's my job." "Exactly," he said. "Which is why this is temporary." Temporary. That word landed softly, like it was meant to reassure me. "So why was my access revoked?" I asked. "Precaution," he said. "Standard." "Why is my name misspelled in official emails?" I asked. Another pause. "Clerical," he said. "And my chair?" I asked, before I could stop myself. He cleared his throat. "Facilities handles that." I waited. "Alyssa," he said finally, using my name correctly for the first time that day. "You didn't do anything wrong." That sentence should have helped. Instead, it made my chest tighten. "Then what's happening?" I asked. "We'll go over everything once legal signs off," he said. "For now, take the rest of the day." "Am I suspended?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "Not at all." "Am I on leave?" "Not exactly." "Am I still employed?" Another pause. "Yes," he said. "Technically." Technically. After we hung up, I sat very still at the table, listening to the refrigerator hum. Baxter curled up under my chair, pressed his back against my feet like he always did. I thought about the papers I'd signed that morning, the binder clip, the yellow tabs. The way Mark had smiled and said, "Makes things easier for everyone." At 4:11, I opened the PDF attachment from the earlier email again. This time, I read it slowly. The language was careful, but not vague. It referenced internal bylaws, risk mitigation protocols, temporary reassignment pending review. There was a section about conflict adjacency that made my stomach drop. It mentioned an HOA, not by name, just as an external governance body under active assessment. My HOA, the one my landlord had reminded me about. The one that required my attendance that night. I scrolled further. There was a paragraph about recusal, about disclosure, about how individuals with dual exposure could not serve in certain advisory capacities. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For 5 years, I'd served on my HOA board, volunteer, unpaid. I'd reviewed budgets, signed off on vendor contracts, handled resident complaints about noise and trash pickup. It had never felt risky. It felt civic, responsible. I'd disclosed it when I was hired. It was in my file. I remembered filling out the form. HOA board member, unit owner, suburban townhouse community, low risk. Apparently, that had changed. At 5:26, my phone buzzed again. A group text from the HOA board. Reminder: tonight's agenda includes the reserve fund vote. Attendance is mandatory. I typed back, "I'll be there." Then I deleted it. Then I typed it again and sent it. The meeting room at the community center smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a long table with name placards that hadn't been updated in years. I took my usual seat at 6:58 p.m. The board president, Tom, glanced at me and smiled too widely. "Glad you could make it," he said. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. At 7:04, he cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, there's a procedural matter." My phone buzzed in my pocket. An email notification. From legal. I didn't open it. Not yet. Because suddenly, I understood something I hadn't seen all day. The office hadn't locked me out to punish me. They'd locked me out to protect themselves. And whatever was about to happen in that room, it had already been decided, just not by me. Tom didn't look down at his notes when he spoke. He looked at the wall behind me, the way people do when they're reading something they've already memorized and don't want to risk getting wrong. "Before we proceed with tonight's agenda," he said, hands folded on the table, "we need to address a compliance issue." The word landed differently here than it had that morning at the office. In the conference room downtown, compliance had sounded like a shield. In this fluorescent-lit community center, it sounded like a gavel. I felt my phone vibrate again in my pocket. Another email. I kept my hands on the table. Tom continued. "As of today, one of our board members has disclosed a potential conflict of interest. My name wasn't said. It didn't need to be." 3 heads turned toward me. 2 others kept their eyes on their folders, suddenly very interested in printed paper. I cleared my throat. "I disclosed my employment when I joined the board," I said. 5 years ago." Tom nodded. "Yes, and at the time, it wasn't an issue." "And now?" I asked. "And now," he said carefully, "new information has come to light." That phrase again. New information. No source. No timeline. Just the suggestion that something had shifted while I wasn't looking. "What information?" I asked. Tom glanced to his right. Linda, the treasurer, adjusted her glasses and slid a single sheet of paper toward him. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't labeled confidential. It looked like any other agenda attachment. Tom read from it anyway. "Due to the nature of ongoing financial decisions," he said, "specifically those related to reserve allocations and vendor contracts, it's been advised that members with professional ties to regulatory or oversight bodies recuse themselves from voting. It is Mako Day." I waited for the sentence to end. It didn't. "So," Tom said, finally looking at me. "Effective immediately, Alyssa will be recused from tonight's vote." "Tonight's vote," I repeated. "On the reserve fund." "Yes," he said. "The one that determines whether we approve the transfer," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's correct." I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, recognition. "Who advised this?" I asked. Tom smiled again. "Legal." "Which legal?" I asked. He hesitated. Just long enough. "Our counsel," he said. "For the association." I nodded slowly. "And when was this advice given?" "This afternoon," Linda said, too quickly. I looked at her. "After 4 p.m.? She blinked. "I'm not sure." Because at 4 p.m., I'd still been technically employed. At 4 p.m., I'd still had access. At 4 p.m., I'd still been inside the system. By 7 p.m., I was not. I leaned back in my chair. "Am I being asked to step aside for tonight?" I said. "Or to resign from the board?" Tom exchanged a glance with Linda. "Tonight," he said. "For now." For now. The meeting moved on without me. They discussed landscaping bids, trash pickup schedules, a noise complaint on Hawthorne Lane. I listened, nodded when appropriate, took notes out of habit. When the reserve fund item came up, Tom cleared his throat again. "As discussed," he said, "Alyssa will abstain." I said nothing. The vote passed. Unanimous. 5 hands raised. Mine stayed flat on the table. The meeting adjourned at 8:12 p.m. People packed up quickly. Chairs scraped. Folders closed. Conversations resumed in low voices. Linda avoided my eyes. Tom approached me with his practiced smile. "Thank you for being understanding," he said. "Of what?" I asked. He faltered. "This situation." "What situation?" I asked again. He exhaled. "You know. The overlap." "I disclosed the overlap," I said. "You accepted it." "Yes," he said. "But circumstances change." "They do," I agreed. I walked out before he could say anything else. The rain had started while we were inside. A light drizzle at first, then heavier. I didn't run. I unlocked my car, sat inside, and waited until my breathing slowed. At home, I opened the email from legal. It was longer than the others, carefully worded, full of references to statutes and internal review protocols. It confirmed what Mark had implied without stating outright. I was under temporary internal review due to potential exposure conflicts arising from external governance involvement. It advised me not to participate in any decision-making bodies, pending clarification. It did not say I was suspended. It did not say I was cleared. It existed in a gray space that felt intentional. At the bottom, there was a sentence I hadn't expected. "Failure to comply may result in further action." I closed the laptop. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake listening to the rain hit the siding, Baxter's steady breathing beside the bed. I replayed the day in my head, not emotionally, but mechanically, like a checklist. The papers, the email, the chair, the badge, the HOA vote. None of it was overtly hostile. None of it violated a rule on its face. That was the problem. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail. It was from the HOA management company. "Alyssa," the woman said, cheerful and professional. "Just following up on last night's meeting. Per council's recommendation, we'll need to update our records regarding your board status. I'll send over the paperwork." Paperwork again. At 9:18 a.m., an envelope arrived by courier. No return address. Inside was a single-page form. Voluntary recusal acknowledgement. I read it twice. It didn't ask me to resign. It didn't state wrongdoing. It simply documented that I was voluntarily stepping back from participation in board matters to avoid the appearance of conflict. Appearance. At the bottom, there was a line for my signature. I set the paper down and stared at it for a long time. This was the value they were taking from me. Not my job, not yet, not my home, not directly. It was my position, my right to participate, my credibility, my voice in decisions that affected my own neighborhood, my own finances, my own walls and roof. They weren't accusing me of anything. They were repositioning me. From insider to risk. From contributor to liability. I called Mark. He didn't answer. I emailed HR. They replied with an automated message. "Your inquiry has been received." I called the HOA management company back. "I have a question about the form," I said. "Of course," the woman replied. "What can I clarify? Is this required?" I asked. There was a pause, a practiced one. "It's recommended," she said. "By whom?" "Our council," she said. "And if I don't sign it?" I asked. Another pause. "Well," she said, "that could complicate things." "How?" I asked. "It might raise concerns," she said. "About what?" She didn't answer directly. "We just want to keep everything clean." Clean. I hung up and sat at the table, the form between my hands. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. Baxter rested his head on my knee. This was the part no one warns you about. Not the explosion, not the confrontation. The quiet narrowing of options. If I signed, I agreed with their framing. I accepted that I was the problem. I made it easier for everyone else. If I didn't, I became difficult, uncooperative, suspicious. Either way, something was already gone. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into a drawer. I didn't sign it. Not yet. Because for the first time since the day before, I stopped asking what I'd done wrong, and started asking who, exactly, was benefiting from me being silent. Silence has a sound when you're used to being included. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small absences you only notice because your body remembers what used to be there. The first thing that disappeared was routine. By Monday morning, my calendar was empty. Not cleared. Empty. No recurring check-ins. No shared reviews. No reminders. Just white space where color-coded blocks had lived for years. I refreshed it twice, convinced it was a sync issue. At Neo, Tray A. I received an email marked, "For your information." It wasn't addressed to me. I was CC'd. Last in the list. The subject line referenced a policy update I'd helped draft 18 months earlier. The body of the email quoted sections I recognized, word for word. My words. But my name wasn't anywhere in it. I read it carefully, then checked the attachment history. The document had been modified on Friday at 6:48 p.m. by someone else. At 9:27, another email arrived. Same format, same CC placement, different topic, vendor oversight. Again, something I'd once been responsible for. I started to see the pattern. They weren't cutting me off entirely. They were repositioning me just far enough away that my presence became optional, observational, passive. At 10:11, Mark walked past my desk again. This time, he slowed. "Hey," he said, like we were running into each other at the grocery store. "Hey," I replied. "How's everything?" he asked. It was a polite question, not a real one. "I'm still waiting on clarification," I said. He nodded. "Legal's being thorough." "About what?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "You know how these things go." I did. That was the problem. At 10:43, my access to the compliance repository was partially restored. Not full access, just enough to view final versions. Read only. At 11:02, a meeting invite appeared on my calendar. A review session. Optional attendance. Optional. I attended anyway. The conference room felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe it was the way people positioned themselves, chairs angled slightly away from me. The discussion moved quickly. Acronyms flew. Decisions were referenced as if they'd already been made somewhere else. When I spoke, the room didn't stop. People nodded, but no one responded directly. My comments floated, untethered. At 11:36, someone summarized a point I'd just made, reframed it, and received agreement. I stopped taking notes halfway through. At lunch, I ate at my desk, not because I wanted to, but because leaving felt like conceding something I couldn't name. I unwrapped a sandwich, took 3 bites, and pushed it aside untouched. My phone buzzed. Another HOA message. This time, it wasn't a group text. It was an email from Tom, following up on council's recommendation. "We'll need to formalize your recusal this week. Let me know when you're available to discuss." Formalize. At 1:10 p.m. HR emailed again. "As discussed, your role remains unchanged at this time. We appreciate your cooperation during the review process." There had been no discussion. At 2:02, I tried to open a file I'd worked on for years. Access denied. I didn't escalate it. I didn't ask IT. I didn't reply all to anyone. I simply noted the time and closed the window. That became my new habit. I started keeping track. Not emotionally, methodically. Timestamps, language patterns. Who said what, and when. Which decisions were framed as temporary, which were framed as best practice. By Wednesday, my name had been removed from 2 distribution lists. By Thursday, 3. By Friday, I stopped being surprised. The HOA followed a similar rhythm. I was still technically on the board. My name still appeared on the website, but decisions began happening without me. Agendas circulated late, supporting documents arrived after votes. Questions I emailed were answered hours later, with polite summaries instead of context. One afternoon, I drove past the community center on my way home from work. The parking lot was full. A meeting I hadn't been told about. I didn't stop. I kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, heart steady in a way that scared me more than panic would have. At home, I opened the drawer where I'd placed the recusal form. It stared back at me, blank. This was the trap. Not force. Not threats. Attrition. If I stayed, I'd be sidelined until my presence was ceremonial. If I left, it would look voluntary. Either outcome cleaned the system, not for fairness, for convenience. Friday evening, Mark called. "Just checking in," he said, "seeing how you're holding up." "I'm noticing some changes," I said. "Yes," he said quickly. That's expected. Are they temporary? I asked. Everything is temporary, he said. That answer used to comfort me. Now it sounded like a warning. Am I being investigated? I asked. He sighed. No one is accusing you of misconduct. That's not what I asked, I said. There was a longer pause this time. We're evaluating exposure, he said carefully. Whose? I asked. Ours, he said. After we hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at the wall until Baxter nudged my hand with his nose. Exposure. That word followed me into the weekend. Saturday morning, I ran errands. Grocery store, hardware store, dry cleaners, normal things. The kind of life admin tasks that ground you when everything else feels uncertain. At the hardware store, I bumped into Linda from the HOA. Oh, she said, surprised. Hi. Hi, I replied. How are you? She asked. Fine, I said. She nodded too quickly. Good, good. Listen, about the board. Yes? I asked. She glanced around. It's nothing personal. I didn't think it was, I said. She smiled, relieved. It's just optics. Tell you, I paid for my items and left before she could say anything else. Optics. By Sunday night, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't trying to fix it anymore. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I wasn't drafting emails in my head. I wasn't wondering how to make myself smaller, quieter, less risky. I was watching. The systems that had once felt neutral now looked coordinated. Not malicious. Efficient. They didn't need me to be wrong. They needed me to be removable. Monday morning, I arrived at the office early. 6:58 a.m. I sat at my desk on a borrowed chair someone had quietly returned without comment and opened a new document. I titled it with the date. I didn't write feelings. I didn't write accusations. I wrote facts. Emails received. Access changes. Meeting exclusions. Language used. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that whatever was happening wasn't random. And whatever came next wouldn't be stopped by asking nicely. Because the real damage wasn't the job, or the board, or the vote. It was the assumption that if they followed procedure, no one would question the outcome. They were wrong about that. I just hadn't decided how much it would cost them yet. The moment everything snapped into focus wasn't loud. There was no raised voice, no confrontation, no email with bolded warnings or red exclamation points. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon at 3:37 p.m. while I was standing in line at the pharmacy. I remember the time because the receipt printed it at the top in gray ink, slightly smudged. Baxter's heartworm medication. 3 months. Paid in full. I tucked it into my wallet without looking, stepped aside so the next person could approach the counter, and felt my phone vibrate. One email. No subject line. I didn't open it right away. I walked out to the parking lot first. The automatic doors sliding shut behind me, the smell of disinfectant and floor cleaner fading into warm asphalt and cut grass. I sat in my car, keys still in my hand, engine off. Then I opened it. The sender was an address I didn't recognize, not a person. A system. The body of the email was short. Please find attached the updated reserve allocation schedule approved by the board. Approved. The attachment name included the date. Yesterday. I stared at the screen for a long moment before opening the file. The spreadsheet loaded slowly, cell by cell, like it was revealing itself on purpose. Columns. Rows. Vendor names. Project timelines. Dollar amounts. And there it was. The transfer. A reallocation of reserve funds into a newly created line item. The description was vague enough to sound harmless. Infrastructure contingency. I scrolled. The vendor name was listed under a holding company I recognized immediately. Not because I'd seen it in HOA documents before, but because I'd seen it at work. Twice. In internal risk reviews. It was a shell. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in the driver's seat, heart steady, hands calm. This wasn't adrenaline. This was clarity. They hadn't recused me to protect the HOA. They'd recused me because I would have flagged this. The thoughts settled without drama. At home, I opened my laptop and pulled up the document I'd started keeping. The one titled with dates instead of emotions. I added a new entry. 3:37 p.m. Received reserve allocation spreadsheet. Approved without my participation. Vendor linked to holding entity previously reviewed by my department. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. I cross-referenced the vendor name with my work notes. I didn't access restricted systems. I used what I already had: public filings, state records, archived meeting minutes. It took less than 20 minutes. The holding company had been registered 6 months earlier. Same week, the HOA had issued its first RFP for infrastructure improvements. The registered agent address matched a law office I'd seen on 2 unrelated compliance matters. Not illegal. Just interesting. At 4018, my phone rang. It was Tom. "Hey," he said, overly casual. "Just wanted to make sure you saw the updated schedule." "I did," I said. "Good," he said quickly. "We moved faster than expected." "I noticed," I said. There was a beat. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I was just curious." "About what?" he asked. "The vendor," I said. "When was that selected?" "Oh," he said, "that was handled through council." "Which council?" I asked. "Our council," he repeated, like a reflex. "Right," I said. "And the conflict determination, was that related to this?" Another pause. "No," he said. "Those were separate issues." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Okay," I said. "Thanks for clarifying." We hung up. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even ask the question he was expecting. I let him believe the explanation had worked. That night, I sat on the floor with Baxter, sorting old paperwork I'd shoved into boxes when I moved. Deeds, HOA bylaws, welcome packets, annual disclosures. I found the conflict of interest policy from the year I joined the board. I read it again, slowly. It didn't say what they'd told me it said. It didn't require recusal for professional experience. It required recusal for direct financial interest. I highlighted the line and saved a scanned copy. Then I opened the email from legal again, the one advising me to avoid participation pending clarification. It referenced an internal guideline, not a law, not a statute, a guideline. I searched the guideline number. It had been revised. Last month, I sat back on the couch, the weight of it pressing into me all at once. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't overcorrection. It was coordination. They'd created just enough ambiguity to move me out of the way without ever accusing me of anything. They'd reframed my presence as risk, then acted quickly in that space. I wasn't collateral damage. I was inconvenient. The next morning, I received a calendar invite. Meeting with legal, optional attendance. Optional. I accepted. The conference room downtown had frosted glass walls and a long oval table, the kind of room designed to feel neutral and authoritative at the same time. 2 attorneys were already seated when I arrived, both polite, both careful. "Thank you for coming," one of them said. "We just want to talk through a few things." "Of course," I said. They asked questions without waiting for answers. Clarifying questions, framing questions, questions that assumed the conclusion they wanted. I answered truthfully, precisely, without volunteering. At the end, one of them smiled and said, "This is all very helpful." "Is it?" I asked. He nodded. "We're confident we're moving in the right direction." "For whom?" I asked. There was a flicker, just a small one. "For the organization," he said. I left with the same clarity I'd entered with. That afternoon, another email arrived from the HOA management company. "We'll be finalizing board role updates this week. Please advise if you have any objections." Objections. They didn't need my consent anymore. They just needed my silence. I didn't reply. Instead, I started organizing what I already had. Not to expose them, not yet. To understand the shape of it. I mapped timelines, board votes, policy revisions, vendor registrations, internal reviews, who knew what, and when. Patterns emerged. Not proof of crime, proof of intent. And that was when I realized the most important thing. They weren't afraid of being caught. They were afraid of being slowed down. Friday evening, Mark called again. "Just wanted to close the loop before the weekend," he said. "I appreciate that," I said. "We expect the review to conclude soon," he said. "Conclude how?" I asked. "With a resolution," he said. For me? I asked. For everyone, he said. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. After the call, I took Baxter for a long walk around the neighborhood, past the same houses I'd helped manage, the same sidewalks I'd advocated to repair, the same streetlights I'd voted to replace. I wasn't angry. I was alert. They'd built this on the assumption that I'd retreat, that I'd protect my job by sacrificing my role, that I'd accept the narrative because it sounded reasonable. They were wrong about one thing. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in timing. Because the problem with systems like this isn't that they break rules. It's that they rely on people not noticing when the rules quietly change. And now that I had noticed, the cost wasn't whether I would speak. It was how much they were willing to pay to keep me quiet. Once you stop assuming coincidence, everything looks different. I didn't wake up the next morning with a plan. I woke up with a question that wouldn't let go. What, exactly, had they made impossible for me to see? That question shaped the rest of the week. I stopped checking my inbox first thing. I stopped refreshing my calendar. Instead, I started with what couldn't be edited retroactively. Time. Every system leaves a trail, even when it thinks it's being careful. Not messages you can delete. Not meetings you can quietly cancel. But sequences, dependencies, things that have to happen in a certain order to look legitimate. I opened my laptop and pulled up public records. Secretary of State filings, HOA annual reports, vendor registrations, nothing proprietary, nothing protected, just data that existed whether anyone wanted me to look at it or not. The holding company from the spreadsheet came up again. Same registered agent, same mailing address, a suite number that didn't actually exist on the building directory. That was common enough. Not illegal, just efficient. I followed the trail backward. The company had been incorporated 2 days after the HOA board approved language authorizing alternative reserve investment structures. Language I remembered reviewing, dismissing as theoretical. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now it felt like scaffolding. I opened the minutes from that meeting. I'd taken them myself. I recognized my phrasing. Clear, neutral, professional. The vote had been unanimous. Except for one thing. The vendor selection wasn't in the minutes. It had been added later. I could tell because the formatting didn't match. Slightly different font size, margins off by a fraction of an inch. To most people, it would look identical. To someone who'd prepared dozens of these documents, it stood out immediately. I checked the document metadata. Created. Thursday, 9:14 p.m. Last modified. Friday, 6:48 p.m. The meeting had been on Tuesday. I leaned back in my chair and let the information settle. They hadn't just removed me from the vote. They'd rewritten the record. At work, my access remained partial, enough to read finalized reports, enough to know what conclusions were being presented, not enough to see how they'd been reached. But reports reference sources. Policies reference revisions. Revisions reference dates. I followed those. An internal guideline cited in legal's email had been updated quietly. No announcement, no firm-wide notice. The changelog listed it as clarification. The clarification narrowed the definition of acceptable external governance involvement. Not retroactively. Prospectively. Except they were applying it backward. I printed the old version, highlighted the language, printed the new version, highlighted the change. I placed them side by side on the table and stared at them for a long time. This wasn't sloppiness. This was design. Wednesday afternoon, I received another message from the HOA management company. Just checking in. We'll need to confirm your availability for a brief call. I replied with a single sentence. Please send questions in writing. There was a delay. Then a polite response. Of course. No questions came. At the office, people had stopped pretending nothing was happening. They didn't whisper. They didn't avoid me dramatically. They adjusted. Meetings were moved to earlier times. Conversations paused when I approached, then resumed with forced normalcy. My input was acknowledged, then deferred. I wasn't being silenced. I was being diluted. Thursday evening, I sat at the kitchen table and spread everything out. Printed policies, board minutes, vendor filings, email timestamps, a legal pad with dates written in neat columns. I didn't label it evidence. I labeled it sequence. Sequence tells you motive without accusing anyone of intent. By Friday, the picture was clear enough to be unsettling. The HOA wasn't being protected from me. It was being used. The reserve funds weren't being mismanaged overtly. They were being repositioned, parked temporarily, routed through entities that insulated decision-makers from direct scrutiny. The firm wasn't distancing itself from the HOA out of caution. It was aligning itself just far enough away to deny involvement while benefiting from the delay. And I was the friction point. I'd seen similar structures before in my professional life. Not criminal, not ethical, profitable. They relied on one thing: time. As long as no one slowed the process down, everything would finalize before anyone asked the wrong question. Friday night, Mark emailed. Quick note before end of week. Legal expects to wrap early next week. Appreciate your patience. Patience, I replied. Understood. Then I opened a new document and titled it with the week's date. I didn't speculate. I didn't editorialize. I wrote what could be proven: public record discrepancies, policy revision timing, meeting minute modifications, recusal justification language that didn't match written policy. I included page numbers, URLs, file hashes. I saved it twice, once locally, once to a personal drive. Not to send, to be ready. Saturday morning, I went to the community center again. Not for a meeting, just to walk past it, to see if anything had changed. A banner hung near the entrance announcing upcoming infrastructure improvements. The vendor name was printed at the bottom, small but visible. I took a photo. No commentary. Just the date and time visible on my phone screen. At home, I uploaded it to the folder. That afternoon, Linda called. I just wanted to check in, she said. You've been quiet. 18. I've been busy, I said. With work? She asked. With understanding, I replied. She laughed nervously. Well, we're all just trying to do what's best. For whom? I asked. She hesitated. For the community. Then transparency shouldn't be a problem, I said. The call ended shortly after. Sunday evening, I sat on the porch with Baxter at my feet, watching neighbors walk by. Kids on bikes, couples with grocery bags, a man jogging with headphones in. This was the life the HOA existed to manage. Ordinary, predictable, safe. And it depended on people believing that governance was boring. It usually was. Until it wasn't. By Monday morning, legal scheduled another meeting. This one wasn't optional. I arrived early. Same room, same chairs, same careful smiles. We're close to a resolution, one of them said. That's good, I replied. We've determined there was no misconduct, he continued. I never alleged any, I said. A flicker. The concern, the other attorney said, was appearance. Of conflict, I finished. Yes, he said. And that appearance has been resolved? I asked. They exchanged a glance. We believe so, he said. How? I asked. By clarifying roles, he said. And ensuring appropriate distance. From what? I asked. The HOA, he said. Which I disclosed, I said. And which policy did not prohibit. He smiled tightly. Policies evolve. So does exposure, I said. Silence. I didn't press. I didn't accuse. I didn't present anything. I let them sit with the fact that I knew more than they thought. After the meeting, Mark walked with me to the elevator. Everything okay? He asked. For now, I said. He nodded. Good. The elevator doors closed. Inside, alone, I finally allowed myself to name it. This wasn't about removing me. It was about controlling the pace. And now that I understood the mechanism, I didn't need to rush. Because systems like this don't collapse when you push them. They collapse when you stop cooperating with the timing they depend on. I stepped out into the lobby, phone in hand, and drafted one email. Not to legal, not to the HOA. To myself, a reminder. You don't need to expose everything. You just need to interrupt it. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning, I felt something close to calm. They still thought this was about whether I'd comply. They hadn't realized yet that compliance wasn't the leverage. Time was. And I had just taken it back. The strange thing about having leverage is that it doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels heavy, Once I understood what was happening, really understood it, the urgency drained out of everything. I stopped waking up with my heart racing. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes. The anxiety that had been buzzing under my skin all week settled into something quieter and more demanding. Responsibility. Because knowing how a system works doesn't just give you options. It forces you to choose what kind of person you're going to be inside it. On Tuesday morning, Legal sent a follow-up email summarizing our conversation. Polite, careful, designed to close the loop without leaving fingerprints. Based on our review, we do not anticipate further action at this time. We appreciate your cooperation. At this time, I read it twice, then archived it without replying. At work, my access remained unchanged. Still read-only, still peripheral. Enough to stay informed, not enough to interfere. That was deliberate. They wanted me calm, but not active. Visible, but harmless. The HOA followed the same pattern. A revised agenda was sent for the next meeting. My name was still listed under board members, but my role was marked as non-voting, temporary. No explanation attached, no timeline offered. Temporary had become permanent adjacent. I could have objected. I could have sent a carefully worded email citing bylaws and policy language. I could have forced them to respond on the record. That's what the old version of me would have done. The version that believed clarity led to correction. But clarity wasn't the problem. Control was. I spent that week watching how people behaved when they thought the risk had passed. Mark stopped checking in. HR went silent. Legal moved on to other things. The HOA management company resumed its usual cadence, sending routine notices and reminders like nothing unusual had happened. The machinery had returned to normal speed. That's when I understood the real dilemma. If I spoke now publicly, formally, decisively, I would interrupt the process. But I would also become the story, the difficult one, the problem employee, the board member who made things messy. If I stayed quiet, the process would complete, the funds would move, the contracts would finalize, everything would become harder to unwind. Either path came with a cost. The question wasn't whether I could stop them. It was whether I wanted to. One evening after work, I met my friend Julia for coffee. We'd known each other since college. She worked in procurement for a manufacturing firm and had a talent for seeing through nonsense quickly. "You look like someone who knows something they wish they didn't," she said after one sip. "I know something," I said. "I'm deciding whether it's my responsibility to act on it." She tilted her head. "Is someone getting hurt?" "Not yet," I said. "Is someone benefiting who shouldn't?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Then they already are," she said. "You're just the one who noticed." That stayed with me. That night, I lay awake thinking about what justice actually looks like in situations like this. Not the dramatic version. Not the kind that ends with apologies or resignations. The quiet kind. The kind where harm doesn't happen because someone decided not to look away. But also the kind where you don't burn yourself down trying to save a structure that was designed to exclude you. Wednesday morning, an unexpected email arrived. From the vendor, not directly, a generic newsletter sent to partners and stakeholders. I was still on a distribution list I hadn't noticed before. The subject line announced a successful expansion into community infrastructure management. The language was glowing, confident, forward-looking. Buried in the third paragraph was a sentence about strategic reserve partnerships finalized last quarter. Last quarter. Before my recusal. Before the vote. I forwarded the email to my personal account and added it to the folder. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. That afternoon, legal scheduled one more meeting. This one framed as a final alignment. I attended. They reiterated that no wrongdoing had been found, that safeguards were in place, that the organization valued integrity. I listened politely, then asked a single question. "Has the reserve allocation been fully executed?" The room went still. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "The process is underway." "Underway," I repeated. "So not complete." "No," he said. "Then it can still be paused," I said. He frowned slightly. "That would require justification." I nodded. "I can provide that." Another silence. They hadn't expected that. "We're not asking you to," the other attorney said carefully. "I know," I replied. I stood up before they could respond. I just wanted to understand the timeline, I said. Thank you. I left the room without waiting for permission. In the hallway, my hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from restraint. I could stop this, not by exposing it, not by making noise, by slowing it down, by asking the kinds of questions that require documentation, that trigger reviews, that force people to check boxes they'd assumed no one would look inside. But doing that would change my position permanently. There would be no return to normal, no quiet reintegration, no, we appreciate your patience. I would become a variable they couldn't control. Thursday evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the document I'd been building open in front of me. The sequence was solid now, clean, verifiable. I didn't need more proof. What I needed was a decision. I thought about the HOA residents. Most of them didn't know my name. They waved when they saw me walking Baxter. They trusted the board to do its job. I thought about my job, the career I'd built by believing that process mattered. That fairness wasn't a feeling, but a structure you could maintain if you paid attention. I thought about what would happen if I walked away. The system wouldn't collapse. It would adjust. Someone else would take my place. The process would finish without friction. I would be safe, employed, quiet. And the next person who noticed something like this would assume it was already been handled, because that's how it works. Friday morning, I opened my calendar and blocked 2 hours the following week. I labeled it Documentation Review. Then I sent one email. Not accusatory, not dramatic, to legal, the HOA management company, and the board president. Before further execution of the reserve allocation, I'm requesting clarification on the conflict determination applied to my recusal, including policy basis and timing. I'll be submitting a written request for records pursuant to governing documents. I read it 3 times before sending. My finger hovered over the mouse. This was the line. Once crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. I clicked send. The response wasn't immediate. It came an hour later. Short, controlled. We'll need to consult counsel. I smiled, just slightly. That was the point. That evening, as I took Baxter for his walk, the sky over the neighborhood was streaked pink and orange, the air cool and calm. Everything looked exactly the same. But I knew better now. I wasn't choosing a fight. I was choosing not to disappear quietly. And whatever happened next, whether I lost my job, my board seat, or my standing, I wouldn't be pretending anymore that this was about misunderstanding. It was about power, timing, and the expectation of silence. They'd counted on my cooperation. What they were about to learn was that I'd already paid the price of being compliant. Anything that came next would be cheaper than that. The moment you interrupt a process, the tone changes. It doesn't announce itself with anger. It shows up as delay. The morning after I sent the email, my inbox stayed quiet. No acknowledgements, no objections, no reassurance, just absence. By noon, I received a calendar invite titled Preliminary Discussion. No agenda, 3 attendees, 30 minutes. I accepted. In the meantime, things slowed. The HOA management company postponed its next bulletin. The vendor's website quietly removed the announcement about strategic reserve partnerships. At work, a report that had been circulating for final sign-off stalled in draft status. Nothing reversed. Nothing canceled. Paused. At 1 p.m., I joined the call. The faces on my screen were neutral, professional, slightly strained, legal. The HOA counsel, Tom, seated too close to his webcam. "Thank you for making time," one of the attorneys said. "We want to ensure alignment. Thanks for watching." As again, "Of course," I replied. They spoke first. They always did. They explained that my request had raised questions about process, that further review was needed to ensure consistency, that no conclusions should be drawn prematurely. I listened. When they finished, I said, "I'm not asking for conclusions." They blinked. "I'm asking for records," I continued. "Policy language, revision dates, the basis for my recusal, that's all." Tom shifted in his chair. "We've already explained—" "You explained verbally," I said. "I'm asking for it in writing." The attorney smiled thinly. "That may take some time." "I understand," I said. "Take what you need." The call ended without resolution. That was fine. Over the next few days, I did very little outwardly. I went to work, I completed the tasks I still had access to, I attended meetings when invited, I spoke when appropriate. I didn't escalate, I didn't confront, I waited. Behind the scenes, the system reacted. On Wednesday, the HOA board meeting was postponed due to scheduling conflicts. On Thursday, legal requested an extension on responding to my records request. On Friday, Mark stopped by my desk. "Just checking in," he said, leaning casually against the partition. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "Just reviewing documentation." He nodded, eyes flicking to my screen. "Anything we should be concerned about?" I met his gaze. "Only accuracy. Ever." He smiled, then walked away. That weekend, I received an automated notice from the HOA portal. "Your access level has been updated." I logged in. I was no longer listed as non-voting. I was listed as inactive. No announcement, no explanation, just a status change. I took a screenshot and saved it with the date. This was the next move. If they couldn't keep me sidelined quietly, they'd formalize my absence. Sunday afternoon, I sat on my porch with my laptop open, Baxter asleep at my feet. I drafted another email. Shorter this time. "I've noticed a change in my board status. Please advise on the procedural basis for this update and any vote or notice associated with it." I sent it and closed the laptop. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. On Monday morning, the response arrived. Not from Tom. From council. They attached a memo. It cited bylaws, quoted sections selectively, referenced authority without context. It concluded that my status had been updated to preserve operational continuity. Continuity. I read it slowly, then opened the bylaws myself. The section they cited required a formal vote, with notice, recorded in minutes. None of that had happened. I replied with a single sentence. "Please provide the meeting minutes reflecting this vote." No reply that day, or the next. By Wednesday, the vendor's contract appeared in a public disclosure filing, finalized, but not executed. The effective date was blank. I smiled when I saw that. They were waiting. Thursday afternoon, legal requested another meeting. This one was longer. This one included someone new, a senior partner. He introduced himself, thanked me for my professionalism, and spoke at length about shared values. When he finished, I said, "I have a question." He nodded. "Why wasn't I given notice before my board status was changed?" I asked. He leaned back slightly. "That was an administrative adjustment." "The bylaws don't allow administrative adjustments," I said. "They require a vote." He smiled. "We interpret them differently." "That interpretation wasn't documented," I said. Another pause. "We're correcting that," he said. "By reversing it?" I asked. "No," he said. "By formalizing it." There it was. They weren't going to put me back. They were going to legitimize my removal. I nodded. "Then I'll need the timeline for that vote." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "So I can submit my statement," I said. "Statement?" Tom asked, startled. "Yes," I said. "The bylaws allow that." They exchanged glances. "Of course," the senior partner said. "We'll coordinate." After the meeting, I sat in my car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, breathing steadily. This was the part people misunderstand. I wasn't winning. I was being contained. They weren't backing down. They were hardening their position, making it defensible. And they were doing it because I'd forced them to slow down. That was enough. Friday morning, I received the notice. Special board meeting, agenda attached. Item 3. Formalization of inactive board member status. I read it twice, then opened a new document. My statement. I didn't accuse anyone of misconduct. I didn't reference the vendor. I didn't mention money. I outlined facts, dates, policies, deviations. I attached exhibits, public filings, screenshots, archived documents. I submitted it within the required window. That afternoon, Mark emailed. "We need to talk." I replied, "Happy to." We met in a small conference room near the elevators. He looked tired. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm making it accurate," I replied. "For what?" he asked. "For the record," I said. He sighed. Do you realize what this could cost you? I met his eyes. Do you realize what it's already cost me? He looked away. The board meeting happened without me. I watched the recording later. They voted. Unanimous. My status was formalized. Inactive. The chair thanked me for my service. That night, an email arrived from legal. Given recent developments, the firm has determined it's in everyone's best interest to separate roles entirely. We're prepared to discuss next steps. There it was. The consequence. They'd slowed down enough. Now they wanted me gone. I closed the email and leaned back on the couch, Baxter's head on my lap. I wasn't surprised. This had never been about whether I was right. It was about whether I'd accept the cost of not being wrong quietly. And now that cost had been named. The question wasn't whether I could stay. It was whether I wanted to. Because the system had revealed itself. And once you see that, going back isn't neutral. It's consent. I reached for my laptop and opened the folder one last time. Everything was there. Organized, time-stamped, ready. I didn't need to send it. Not yet. But for the first time, I understood exactly what power looked like in a place like this. It wasn't exposure. It was the ability to walk away with the truth intact. And that decision, the one they thought they were forcing on me, was about to become mine. The meeting they scheduled to end it all was set for a Thursday at 9 a.m. No dramatic title, no ominous language, just next steps discussion in a neutral font, sent from legal with 3 names in the CC line and no agenda attached. I didn't prepare the way I would have a month earlier. No color-coded notes, no rehearsed explanations, no contingency scripts. I prepared by sleeping. I woke up early, fed Baxter, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching steam curl up from the mug. Outside, a delivery truck idled on the street, then moved on. The neighborhood was quiet in the way it always was on weekday mornings, people leaving for work, kids waiting for buses, nothing remarkable. I dressed carefully, not formally, not defensively, just like myself. When I arrived at the office, my badge still worked. That detail felt almost intentional, like they wanted to end things cleanly. The conference room was larger than usual. Windows on 2 sides, a long table, water pitchers already set out. The senior partner was there again, along with HR this time. Mark sat near the end, hands folded, eyes tired. "Thank you for coming," the senior partner said. "We want to have an open conversation." I nodded and sat down. HR spoke first, carefully, about alignment, about risk, about how sometimes roles evolve in ways that make continued employment complicated. No accusations, no raised voices. Then legal spoke, about boundaries, about reputational considerations, about how my external activities, though disclosed, had become intertwined with internal matters in ways that were no longer sustainable. They spoke for 15 minutes without interruption. When they finished, the senior partner looked at me. "We want to know how you're feeling about all this." I almost laughed. "Clear," I said. He smiled, relieved. "Good. Clear about what?" Mark asked quietly. I turned to him. "About what this is. It's something HT." The room went still. "This isn't about compliance," I continued, "or conflict, or appearance." The senior partner's smile tightened. "This is about timing," I said. "And friction." HR shifted in her seat. "You needed the process to move," I said. I slowed it down. "Now you want to remove the obstacle." "That's not fair," Mark said quickly. "It doesn't have to be," I replied. "It just has to be accurate." The senior partner cleared his throat. "We're prepared to offer a separation package," he said. "One that recognizes your contributions." I nodded. "I assumed you would." He slid a folder across the table. "We think this is a reasonable path forward." I didn't open it. "Before we talk about that," I said, "I have one question." He gestured for me to continue. "Has the reserve allocation been executed?" I asked. The senior partner hesitated. "Why is that relevant?" "Because, if it has," I said, "then this meeting is about closure. If it hasn't, it's about control." Silence. "No," he said finally. "It has not." I nodded. "Good." Mark looked between us. "What does that change?" "It changes who's making the decision," I said. I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. Not the whole folder, not the timeline, just one page. It was my statement. The one I'd submitted to the HOA, with exhibits attached. I've already requested records formally, I said. Under governing documents. That process is active. The senior partner's expression hardened slightly. I haven't alleged misconduct, I continued. I haven't contacted regulators. I haven't shared anything externally. HR leaned forward. Are you threatening to? No, I said. I'm explaining context. I paused, letting that land. If I leave quietly, I said, you can finalize everything without further delay. Ask Ho. And if you don't? The senior partner asked. Then you'll need to answer questions, I said. Not accusations, questions. Mark closed his eyes briefly. This doesn't have to be adversarial, the senior partner said. It already is, I replied. You're just used to being on one side of it. He studied me for a long moment. What do you want? He asked. It was the first honest question anyone had asked me all week. I took a breath. I want my work to end cleanly, I said. I want the record to reflect what actually happened, and I want no conditions attached to my departure. HR blinked. No non-disparagement? No, I said. No confidentiality? She asked. Not beyond standard privacy, I said. No language that implies wrongdoing, no language that limits my ability to answer factual questions if asked. The senior partner leaned back. That's not standard. Neither was removing me from the process without notice, I said. Another silence. Mark finally spoke. If we agree, he said quietly. Will you walk away? I looked at him. I already have, I said. I'm just deciding how. The meeting recessed for 10 minutes. I stayed in my seat. When they returned, the tone had shifted. We can revise the terms, the senior partner said. There will be no admission of fault on either side. Good, I said. There shouldn't be. And you'll withdraw from the HOA entirely, he said. I nodded. I already have. He frowned. You resigned? I submitted my resignation this morning, I said. Effective immediately. Mark looked up sharply. You didn't tell me. I wasn't required to, I said. That was the moment I saw it land. The leverage hadn't been the documents. It had been the choice. I wasn't asking them to remove me. I'd already removed myself from the piece they were trying to control. The separation agreement was revised by the end of the day. Clean, quiet, mutual. I didn't negotiate for more money. I didn't ask for a title change or a recommendation letter. I didn't want anything that tied me to the narrative they were constructing. When I signed, it was at 4:26 p.m. I noted the time out of habit. I walked out of the building with a small box of personal items and my bag over my shoulder. The lobby looked the same as it always had. People came and went. No one stopped me. Outside, the air was cool and clear. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the wheel, feeling the strange weightlessness that comes after a decision you didn't know you were strong enough to make. My phone buzzed. An email from the HOA management company. Given your resignation, we'll be moving forward with operational updates. Thank you for your service. I deleted it without replying. I drove home slowly, took Baxter for a walk, fed him dinner. Normal things. Later that night, I opened my laptop and looked at the folder one last time. Everything was still there, untouched, unsent. I closed it and shut the laptop. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't won in the way stories like this are supposed to end. But I had done something far more disruptive. I'd refused to let them define the terms of my exit. And in a system built on control and timing, that was the one outcome they couldn't manage. They could move forward now. So could I. The only difference was that I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. And I didn't need to take it with me. People assume the hardest part is walking away. It isn't. The hardest part is what comes after when no one is forcing you anymore, when the pressure disappears, and you're left alone with the question you managed to postpone for weeks. What am I actually going to do with what I know? The morning after my last day, I woke up at the same time out of habit. 6:12 a.m. Baxter scratched once at the door and stopped. I got up, made coffee, stood at the counter, and waited for the familiar jolt of urgency that usually came with mornings. It didn't come. There were no emails to check, no calendar alerts, no documents waiting for review, just quiet. I took Baxter for a long walk through the neighborhood, past the same houses I'd helped manage, past lawns I'd argued over budgets to maintain, past sidewalks that had once felt like shared responsibility instead of background scenery. Neighbors waved. One woman asked if I'd be at the next HOA meeting. I smiled and said no, not anymore. She nodded like that made sense. It was strange how quickly the world accepted my absence. Back home, I opened my laptop and stared at the folder one last time. Everything was there. The sequence, the policy changes, the filings, the screenshots, the emails, clean, organized, ready to be sent anywhere, to anyone, at any time. I didn't feel anger when I looked at it. I felt tired, because the truth was, I could still do it. I could send it to regulators. I could forward it to the HOA residents. I could file complaints, request audits, trigger investigations that would drag on for months or years. I had enough to make life very uncomfortable for a lot of people, and for a few days, that thought sat with me. Not as revenge, as balance. They had maneuvered me out, they had protected themselves, they had assumed silence. Why shouldn't there be consequences? I made another cup of coffee and sat down, forcing myself not to rush the answer. What would actually happen if I sent it? The HOA would freeze. Meetings would be canceled. Lawyers would take over. Residents would panic. Assessments might spike. Projects would stall. The firm would circle the wagons. Internal reviews. Carefully worded statements. Quiet settlements. And me? I would become the story. Not the systems, not the process. Me, the former employee, the disgruntled board member, the woman who couldn't let it go. It wouldn't matter how clean the facts were. It wouldn't matter that I'd acted carefully, methodically, within the rules. The narrative would be decided without me, just like everything else had been. I closed the folder. That afternoon, I received an email from a recruiter, a position I'd applied to weeks earlier, back when I didn't know how much my life was about to shift. They wanted to schedule an interview. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then replied yes. The next day, another email arrived. From the HOA management company. Not formal. Not legal. Just a short note. We're in the process of finalizing outstanding matters. Please let us know if you have any concerns. Concerns. I almost laughed. They were still bracing, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't reply. Instead, I drafted a different email. To myself. I wrote out, in plain language, what I believed had happened. No legal framing, no strategy, just truth, stripped of leverage. I read it once, then deleted it, because something had changed. I wasn't deciding whether to punish them. I was deciding whether to carry this forward. And that was when the real twist landed, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet certainty. I didn't want their system to be fair. I wanted it to stop being mine. That night, I took the folder and moved it. Not to the cloud, not to a drive. To an external hard drive I'd bought years earlier and never used. I labeled it with the date and placed it in a drawer. Not destroyed. Not weaponized. Contained. The power wasn't in releasing it. The power was in choosing not to. Because the truth no one tells you is this. Once you understand how these systems work, once you see the machinery clearly, participating on any side starts to feel like complicity. I didn't want to reform it. I didn't want to expose it. I wanted out. A week later, I sat in an interview room across from two people who didn't know my story. They asked about my experience. I answered honestly, without bitterness, without omission. They asked why I'd left my last role. I stepped away, I said, when I realized staying would require me to ignore things I couldn't unsee. They nodded, like they understood more than I'd said. Maybe they did. When I got home, Baxter greeted me with the same enthusiasm he always had. The world hadn't collapsed. No investigations had been launched. No one had called to threaten me or beg for silence. Nothing happened. And that was the point. A month later, I received one final message. From Mark. Short. Uncharacteristically direct. I hope you're doing well. I wanted you to know the reserve allocation was redirected. Different vendor, quietly. I read it twice. No apology. No admission. Just information. I typed a response, then deleted it. I didn't owe him closure. The system had adjusted. Not because I exposed it. Because I'd refused to participate on their terms. That evening, I sat on the porch again, watching the sun drop behind the houses. Baxter lay at my feet, warm and solid and unconcerned with governance structures or reserve funds. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way. How tempting it would have been to burn it all down, to demand acknowledgement, to force justice in the only language these systems recognize. But justice that requires your continued entanglement isn't freedom. It's just another role. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't reclaimed a seat at the table. I'd done something quieter, and in some ways harder. I'd refused the prize. I'd walked away from leverage, from recognition, from the satisfaction of being right. And in doing so, I'd taken the one thing they couldn't restructure, revise, or reframe. My consent. The world didn't applaud. No one thanked me. Life simply moved forward. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning when everything started, that felt like the most honest ending possible. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They showed up in fragments, scattered across weeks, in the kind of quiet adjustments that only register if you're paying attention. 2 weeks after I left, the HOA sent out its quarterly newsletter. I received it automatically, my email still on a general list no one had bothered to clean up. The language was upbeat, forward-looking. There was a brief paragraph announcing a revised infrastructure strategy and thanking residents for their patience during the review period. No mention of vendors. No mention of delays. No mention of me. I read it once and deleted it. At my old office, things shifted too, though I only heard about it secondhand. A former colleague texted me one afternoon with a screenshot of an internal announcement. A reorganization, new reporting lines, a temporary pause on external advisory engagements, pending alignment. The wording was familiar. Mark didn't reach out again. I didn't expect him to. What surprised me wasn't the speed with which the system adapted. It was how quickly everyone seemed relieved that it had. People like clean endings. They like narratives that resolve without discomfort. A quiet departure, a revised plan, a new vendor, a reshuffled org chart. It lets everyone move on without asking what almost happened. And maybe that was the real aftermath, not damage, but erasure. At first, that bothered me more than I expected. I'd spent weeks being hyper-aware, tracking every shift, every omission, every half-truth. I'd been braced for fallout, for anger, for consequences that would confirm I'd made the right choice. Instead, there was calm. Too much calm. It made me question myself in ways the confrontation never had. Had I imagined the severity? Had I overestimated my role? Had it really mattered at all? Those questions crept in during quiet moments. Folding laundry, waiting in line, standing at the sink, washing dishes while Baxter lay on the kitchen floor, tail thumping softly every time I moved. I learned quickly that the absence of retaliation doesn't feel like vindication. It feels like anticlimax. The new job moved forward steadily. Interviews, a background check, an offer. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't senior leadership. It was solid, clear boundaries. No volunteer boards tied to regulatory oversight. No blurred lines between civic duty and professional risk. When I accepted, the hiring manager said, "We like people who know when to step away." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. On my first day, I arrived early, sat at a clean desk, and logged into a system that had nothing to do with my past life. No shared calendars, no lingering access. No invisible threads tying me back to decisions I no longer believed in. That felt like relief. But relief has a shadow. Without the tension, without the constant assessment of risk and timing, I had space to think about what I'd actually lost. Not the job, not the board seat, not the leverage. I'd lost a version of myself I'd believed in for a long time. The one who thought that systems corrected themselves if you followed the rules closely enough. That fairness was a function of transparency. That participation was always better than withdrawal. I'd built my career on those assumptions. I'd volunteered my time on those assumptions. I'd accepted inconvenience, discomfort, and silence on those assumptions. Letting them go felt like grief. Not sharp, dull, persistent. One evening, about a month after everything ended, I ran into Linda again. This time at the grocery store. She spotted me near the produce section and hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to approach. "Hi," she said finally. "Hi," I replied. She glanced at my cart, then back at me. "How have you been?" "Good," I said. And for the first time, it wasn't performative. "That's good," she said. She shifted her weight. "Things have been busy." "I imagine," I said. She nodded. "The board's going through some changes." I waited. "They brought in an outside consultant," she continued, "to review processes." I met her eyes. "That makes sense." She looked relieved that I didn't sound angry. "You know," she said carefully, "there were some discussions about how everything was handled." I tilted my head. "Were there?" She nodded. "Not officially. Just people talking." "About what?" I asked. She hesitated. "About whether we moved too fast." I thought about the weeks I'd spent documenting, waiting, choosing restraint over reaction. "Maybe," I said. She swallowed. "I'm sorry things ended the way they did." I believed her. That was the strange part. "I'm not," I said. She looked surprised. "Really?" she asked. "Really," I said. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "take care of yourself." "You too," I replied. We parted without awkwardness. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at a stack of apples I didn't need, and felt something shift. That conversation didn't give me closure. It gave me distance. The system hadn't collapsed. It hadn't been exposed. It hadn't even been publicly corrected. But it had adjusted. Not out of shame, out of caution. That was the consequence. Quiet oversight, added layers, consultants, revised procedures. Enough friction to discourage a repeat without ever admitting the first iteration had been flawed. And me? I'd become a reference point. Not a hero, not a whistleblower. A variable. The kind people remember when they're deciding how far they can push something next time. I didn't know how to feel about that. Some nights, I opened the drawer where the external hard drive sat and rested my hand on it without taking it out. Not as a threat, as a reminder. I hadn't destroyed the truth. I hadn't released it either. It existed, intact, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. That mattered more than I'd expected. As time passed, the urge to revisit everything faded. Not because it wasn't important, but because it no longer belonged to my present. I stopped checking HOA notices. I stopped scanning news for familiar names. I stopped wondering whether I should have done more. The questions that replaced those were quieter and harder. What does responsibility look like when no one is watching? What does integrity mean when it costs you nothing and gains you no recognition? What kind of life do you build when you stop measuring your worth by your proximity to power? I didn't have answers right away, but I had space. On a Sunday afternoon, months later, I sat on the porch with Baxter asleep beside me and watched the neighborhood go by. Kids had grown taller. Lawns had been reseeded. A house down the street had new siding. Life continued, indifferent to governance structures and reserve allocations. That used to bother me. Now it felt like a gift. The system moved on without me, and I moved on without it. Not triumphantly, not bitterly, just deliberately. And that, I was starting to understand, was the real aftermath. Not what they lost, but what I refused to carry forward. The story people expect always ends with a reveal. A final email. A public apology. Someone losing their job. A headline that confirms you were right all along. This story doesn't have that ending. It ends much more quietly. It ends on an ordinary Tuesday, months after everything unraveled, when I realized I hadn't thought about any of it for an entire day. Not the board. Not the firm. Not the reserve funds. Not the folder in the drawer. I noticed it that evening while rinsing dishes at the sink. The window above the counter was open just enough to let in the sound of cicadas and a breeze that smelled like cut grass. Baxter was asleep on the kitchen floor, legs twitching in a dream. My phone was on the table behind me, face down, silent. No alerts, no reminders, no sense of waiting for something to happen. That was when it hit me. I was no longer bracing. For weeks after I left, my body had stayed alert, like it was waiting for a delayed impact. A call, a letter, some consequence that would retroactively justify the stress, the restraint, the choice to walk away. But nothing came. And in that absence, something unexpected took root. Peace. Not the kind you announce, not the kind you defend, the kind you only recognize after it's been there long enough to feel normal. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, letting the day settle around me. Later that night, I opened the drawer and took out the hard drive. I hadn't touched it in weeks. I held it in my hands, heavier than it looked, not because of the plastic and metal, but because of what it represented. Proof, leverage, a version of justice I could still choose if I wanted to. I plugged it into my laptop. The folder opened instantly. Familiar structure, familiar names, everything exactly where I'd left it. For a moment, I let myself imagine it. Sending the files, watching the fallout, knowing I'd changed the narrative permanently. I didn't feel tempted. I felt tired. Not tired like someone who's been defeated. Tired like someone who's finished. I ejected the drive and set it back in the drawer, this time without ceremony. I didn't lock it away. I didn't move it to a safer place. I simply let it exist, because the truth was, I didn't need it anymore. The power I'd thought it held had already done its work, not through exposure, but through choice. I'd chosen not to stay. I'd chosen not to play along. I'd chosen not to become the kind of person who mistakes escalation for resolution. That choice didn't make me virtuous. It made me free. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and unremarkable. Baxter stretched, yawned, thumped his tail against the bed like he always did. I didn't check my phone. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing at the counter, watching a neighbor load groceries into their trunk across the street. Another ordinary moment. Another sign that the world hadn't ended just because I'd stepped out of a system that once defined me. At work, the day passed without incident. A meeting, a review, a problem solved the straightforward way. No politics, no subtext. No sense that I needed to read between the lines. On my lunch break, I walked outside and sat on a bench with my sandwich, feeling the sun on my face, and realized something else. I trusted myself again. Not the version of myself that had tried to make everything work. Not the version that believed patience was always rewarded and silence was always noble. The version that knew when to stop. That trust was the real inheritance of everything that had happened. Not evidence. Not vindication. Not a cautionary tale I could tell at parties. Just clarity. A few weeks later, I ran into Mark one last time. It was unplanned. A coincidence at a coffee shop near the office I used to work in. He looked older, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. We recognized each other at the same time. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two people who shared something neither of us wanted to unpack. "How have you been?" he asked. "Good," I said. "Honestly?" He nodded. "That's good." He hesitated. "Things are different now." "I figured," I said. He took a breath. "You were right about some things." I looked at him. "I know." He smiled faintly, like that hurt and relieved him at the same time. "I wish it hadn't gone the way it did." "So do I said, and meant something different than he did. We didn't talk about the details. We didn't talk about what almost happened, or what had quietly been changed because of it. We talked about the weather, about how busy things were, about nothing that mattered. When we parted, there was no closure, no forgiveness scene, no dramatic acknowledgement, just distance. And that was enough. That night, as I took Baxter for a walk, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. The neighborhood was calm, predictable, safe. I thought about how much energy I'd once spent trying to belong to systems that measured worth in proximity and compliance. I thought about how easily I'd accepted that as normal. And I thought about the quiet courage it takes to stop explaining yourself when no explanation will ever be enough. I didn't win. Not in the way stories like to frame it. No one crowned me right. No one admitted fault. No system was dismantled in my name. But I didn't lose either. I kept my agency. I kept my voice. I kept my life intact. And I learned something that no policy, no role, no board seat had ever taught me. Some victories don't look like justice. They look like absence. Absence of fear. Absence of obligation. Absence of the constant calculation of how to stay acceptable. I didn't walk away because I was weak. I walked away because I was done letting other people decide what I was allowed to tolerate. That was the collapse. Not of a system, but of a belief I no longer needed. The belief that staying was the same as being strong. It isn't. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is leave with your integrity unnegotiated, your truth intact, and your future unclaimed by anyone who didn't earn it. That's how my story ends. Not with a warning, not with revenge, but with a door closing behind me, quietly, finally, and a life on the other side that belongs to me alone.